Hello everyone, this is Dr. Catalana. The purpose of this presentation is to give you a brief overview of informative feedback. Now to clarify, this does go along with an assigned reading, the 7 essentials of quality feedback. So I don't want to spend too long on this because it's more important that we have the ability to practice giving feedback, and we'll talk about an opportunity for you to do so at the end of this presentation. But just to give you a brief overview of informative feedback, some learning objectives that I plan to cover are listed here. The main thing I want you to focus on are the differences between feedback and advice and feedback and evaluation. It's really important that we see feedback as a tool for our students, and that's why we will focus on those qualities of effective feedback. So before we get any further, what is feedback in the first place? So I want you to imagine being a student, because you are. What are some good sources of feedback that you have received? And then what are some bad sources? Most likely it's easier to think of those bad examples. And most of you would probably say that no feedback is frustrating, or when you just get a grade on something and you don't know where that grade came from. So one thing that you may not actually know is when a teacher gives you a grade, that's really not feedback. That's what we call evaluation. So to define feedback, we always need to focus on pointing back to a goal or pointing back to, in our case, in education, a learning objective. I like to illustrate this by an example that's not related necessarily to academic content. It will help prove my point here. So imagine we have a baseball team and my coach tells me, each time you swung and missed, you raised your head as you swung, so you didn't really have your eye on the ball. On the one you hit hard, you kept your head down and saw the ball. So imagine yourself as a baseball player. Obviously, you have a goal to hit the ball with the bat. In this case, that would be your learning objective. So the reason this is feedback is because the coach is giving you advice based on that goal and then giving you action in terms of how to reach that goal. So each time you swung and missed, you raised your head as you swung, so you didn't really have your eye on the ball. So we have a clear goal of hitting the ball and the clear issue of you did not keep your eye on the ball. On the one you hit hard, you kept your head down and saw the ball. So now I'm giving you the action of keeping your head down, and that is leading you toward your goal and success of actually hitting the ball. So the key to having really quality feedback is pointing the students back to the learning objective, which seems super obvious, but actually it's very common that we forget to do this, and that is why for this artifact analysis, we keep telling you to go back to your learning objective. So the article that I gave you went into great detail about these essentials of feedback, so I won't spend time going through all of them in detail, but just to kind of give you an overview of what you should have read. First, feedback is always goal referenced. It is explicitly linked to standards and or our learning objectives. In the baseball example, it's pretty obvious that we want to hit the ball. Learning objectives are not as obvious, so it is important to focus your students on what you want them to be working on. Feedback should be tangible and transparent. In other words, it needs to make sense to the learner. It should be actionable, so it shouldn't just say you did this wrong. It should tell you what to do next. Sorry for that typo, friendly, meaning that this feedback is written for the students and not for the teacher. So those first 4 are kind of how you should craft your feedback, and we'll keep looking at those first 4 components as we look through some examples. The final 3 are more about how often and how consistently we give feedback. So First and foremost, feedback should be really timely. We should try our best not to have a large gap between when we give an assignment and then when we follow up with feedback. I will be the first to admit I'm not good at that. And I think the reason is I'm so focused on being really detailed, giving actionable feedback, that sometimes I will sacrifice timely feedback for detailed feedback. That is something as an educator that I'm working toward. Something that I've been working toward, particularly with your Blackboard quizzes, is I have feedback that's already written, so that I'm trying to make those efforts toward more timely feedback. But I've got to be open that I don't have this figured out. I am going through kind of best practices and being honest about real world challenges to give quality feedback. It's hard to do so in a timely manner, and I think I highly pressure myself to give timely feedback. So that's something I'm working on. Feedback should also be ongoing, so give as many opportunities for feedback as possible. Now, that does not mean that it has to be written. Hopefully, some of my students have realized that I've been encouraging you to call me instead of email me. That's because I think it's a lot easier to give timely and ongoing feedback via phone than it is email. And it's easier to actually respond to questions on the phone. And lastly, you want your feedback to be consistent. And what I mean by consistent in this case is you want your feedback to be pointing consistently to the same goal. So if for some reason, halfway through baseball practice, your coach starts talking about how you're not running fast enough, well, the original goal was working on your hit, so now all of a sudden your feedback is shifted. That can be very confusing to students. So make sure that you're consistently giving feedback about a specific goal. I would never ask you to memorize these. Again, I want you to be able to apply them. So make sure that you are able to look at samples of feedback and even to write samples of feedback based on your own assessments. So I actually copied and pasted this directly from one of your readings, or actually your only reading for this. The difference between feedback and advice. Advice, it sounds like you're actually helping, but oftentimes advice for students can seem very all over the place. So for example, you need more examples in your report. You might want to use a lighter baseball bat. You should have included some essential questions in your unit plan. Oftentimes, as educators, we go straight to advice. And what happens is we're trying to make all of the learning decisions for the student, where feedback will point back to the learning objective and provide emphasis on some steps that they could take to reach that objective. Advice often seems unrelated. So we are quick to give advice, but what happens with advice is we will quickly lose sight of the learning objective. So advice that comes out of the blue can oftentimes get kind of frustrating for our students. There is always something that our students could do better. There's always something that we as educators could do better. So when we receive advice after advice after advice, it gets really overwhelming. So advice is kind of less thought out, and usually it's all over the place in terms of our learning objective. So feedback is more intentional, and it should be more directly related to your learning objective. So we always encourage goal-oriented feedback versus general kind of sporadic advice. Another important delineation is feedback versus evaluation or grades. So a lot of times students see their grades as feedback. Well, feedback is meant to give you action toward reaching your goal, right? So as I'm giving feedback on your artifacts, I'm giving you action toward achieving a higher grade on your final artifact analysis. So if I simply give you a grade, you can't take action on it. So examples like good work, this is a weak paper, you got a C. What do you do with that? If you can't do anything with the information, it's typically not feedback. Now this portion was not within your reading. I do think it's important to recognize that there are various types of feedback. So I just want to go through 3 different terms and then bring up the concept of zone of proximal development, which we have previously discussed in class. So there are 3 main types of feedback. We have scaffolded, self-referenced, and standards referenced. Now, you should be able to kind of work your way toward what these mean. We've seen the word scaffold before. You should be hopefully thinking of the zone of proximal development. Maybe you can trace that back to Vygotsky. Scaffolds are supports. So think about a building that's under construction. A scaffold are those kind of metal things that go around the building, and they're temporarily supporting the building as it's being constructed. So scaffolding literally means support. Break the task into smaller parts, leading students step by step. Scaffolded feedback will provide support for them to reach the goal. Self-reference feedback is pretty self-explanatory, right? So we have that word self. So self-reference feedback points the students back to themselves. And this is a really good tool to use when students are struggling with confidence. I love to have students chart how they have improved. So self-reference feedback is saying, compared to last week, this is how you're doing. And lastly, standards reference feedback is when we're pointing students to a standard. An example would be the directions that we gave, or an exemplar, meaning I gave you a previous student's work and said, look how this student did X. So standards reference is this cute little kiddo is comparing herself to how the directions perhaps said that she needed to complete the project, or comparing yourself to the sample work. Typically, feedback is a combination of these things. So if it's scaffolded, I'm giving students support. Usually as I'm giving support, I'm also pointing back to the original directions or the example. And of course, self-referenced is always important in terms of promoting a growth mindset. Okay, so here's your zone of proximal development. Remember what the students can do without help, what I can do with appropriate support, that's your zone, and then outside what I can't do even with appropriate support. So that green, again, I call that the comfort zone, the bored zone. You should not be providing feedback in that comfort zone. Why? Because they've already achieved your goal. So you shouldn't be giving feedback toward a goal that's already achieved. Your blue is your learning zone, or the zone of proximal development. They still need your support, and that is where feedback is beautiful. So within your zone of proximal development, you are giving students feedback. I would also hazard you against giving feedback in this so-called freakout zone. It's really frustrating to get feedback towards a goal that just seems impossible. So as educators, of course, our sweet spot is this blue. We've been over this concept before, but I wanted to make sure that I mentioned it within this concept as well. Okay, so lastly, I'd like to look at a couple of samples. So go ahead and pause your video for a moment and see how you feel about this sample grading. Is there feedback here? Is it self-oriented? Or I'm sorry, is it goal-referenced? Is it tangible and transparent? Is it actionable? So pause and kind of give yourself a moment to analyze. Okay, so first off, we see that this has a grade. So most likely this is summative. Why? Because it has a grade, and also I'm seeing final writing piece evaluation. So just because it has a grade does not mean I can't provide feedback, but it does mean that most of this feedback could be frustrating to the students unless we have another assignment coming up that will have, excuse me, I'm sorry, my computer just messed up, unless we have another assignment coming up in which the students will have the ability to work toward that same learning objective. So let's look through this here. We clearly have a writing workshop, and we have some pretty clear goals. So we're checking through a final draft down to peer revision, and we have a writing process. So it seems to be pretty goal referenced. Given the fact that this is summative, it's hard for me to really analyze, well, what do I do next? Mainly because this is a really good grade. We see well written. And this is the part that I really wanted to kind of point out here. If we're talking about goal referenced, well written is pretty vague. We're not really quite sure what that means. So it's not super transparent what we mean by well written. Also seeing that component paragraphs contain necessary parts. We don't know what that is either. Let's focus on the comments. So nicely done. You've done an excellent job writing, revising, and putting ideas together. Examples are plentiful and helpful. They really bring the paper alive, right? So this quality, those are the positives. Now let's keep reading. You're having some difficulty still with run-on sentences. Let's review those. Also review those common rules for compound sentences. So this is where we get some actionable feedback. All right, looks like I need to work on my run-on sentences, and looks like I need to work on compound sentences. The only issue is within all of these things we are checking off, I don't see anything about run-ons or compounds. Most likely, this is going into writing mechanics, but in terms of providing feedback, I don't really see actionable items that give me a lot of information. I do think it's somewhat user-friendly because at least we have a well-designed feedback form here. But just to summarize, this is definitely more summative. So we have a final writing piece evaluation. We have some form of feedback of where we're doing well and where we need help. The only issue of where do we need to improve is still pretty vague. So yes, it's well written, but we don't know what necessary parts are missing. And particularly with that actionable feedback, we're not sure where run-ons and compound sentences would be. So again, this is the kind of practice that I want to do, looking at examples and then evaluating for these main essential components. Here's another one. This is one of my favorite feedback forms called stars and steps, meaning stars are this is what you've done well, and then steps meaning steps for improvement. So take a minute, pause the video, and look at this. The main thing you should be noticing, which is such a huge component of this form, are the short story learning targets. So down here, I'm listing my goals. So that's great evidence for being goal referenced, right? So since I'm being transparent about the goals right here, my learning targets, it's a lot easier for my students to see how they are doing. So let's see, it's tangible, it's transparent for sure. I liked how your resolution was entertaining and ended with George almost saving the world. You also used believable dialogue that would be used in real life. Okay, so let's look at how that relates to my learning targets. I can use supporting details to create a believable conflict. Kind of, because a resolution has to do with a conflict. I can write a story with a conflict that is resolved in a way that entertains the reader. See how she wrote, I liked how your resolution was entertaining, so that's directly related. I can write a story with believable dialogue. Okay, you can see those almost even the same terms used in her feedback as the learning target. So this is very well aligned. Okay, let's look at the steps. I don't think you had enough details to support your conflict. Explaining what Y2K was would help. You could also include more details to lead up to the conflict. Okay, so I love this because the teacher is giving action steps for next time. So provide more supporting details and give a little bit more background leading up to the conflict. Okay, so I would say that comparatively this is a more quality sample, and the main things that makes this so well done are your targets being clearly listed. Okay, lastly, let's look at this one. This is a mid-chapter checkpoint. I actually took this from a sample ed TPA, not here at Winthrop, but one that I found in different sources. So take a pause and let's look here. All right, now first of all, is this goal referenced? The short answer is yes. Actually, if you look down here in this fine print, count and tell how many, write the number. This right here, the cc.k, that's a standard. So this is well aligned. I wouldn't say it's the best format because remember that these should be for the students, right? I strongly doubt that your students are going to go down there and read, count, and tell how many, write the number, and know anything about what that means. So it is goal reference, but I think it could be written in a more user-friendly manner. Is it tangible and transparent? Well, yes, but look at all of the feedback that's written. Great job on checking your numbers. Excellent job on marking as you count. You really have this skill down. You are such a smart cookie. Okay, so I'm seeing some positive and some negatives. First off, it is definitely very specific. So he or she is saying, oh, look, you're marking things as you count. That's very actionable. Checking your numbers, he or she recognized that the student ended up fixing something and rewrote it. But what I do see here is a lot of you're smart and a lot of way to go and a lot of smiley faces and a lot of you have this skill down, which is a little bit more focused on that fixed mindset of you can't control how smart you are. So I would say we'd want to be careful with that in the future. So all of this to be said, this leads into your next artifact, which is the informative feedback chart, and that is your assignment that goes along with this. I will say that the informative feedback chart tends to confuse students a little bit, but not to be concerned. I did upload an instructional video for that. You do have a draft of that due on Sunday. But I will be sure to provide lots of opportunities for some analysis, peer review, as well as review from me. So again, this was a brief overview of informative feedback. And your big takeaway here is to make sure that your informative feedback is directly related to a standard or learning objective. Thanks, and I hope you're all doing well.